Hello everyone, this is Angela Shambach with the Vermont DEC Lakes and Ponds program, and you are looking at part 2 of our training for cyanobacteria monitors on Vermont's inland lakes and Lake Champlain. There are 2 other parts to this series. Part 1 is a general introduction to cyanobacteria, and part 3 explains how you can upload your data to the Vermont Department of Health tracking website. As I mentioned, I'm Angela Shambach. I work together with the Vermont Department of Health and the Lake Champlain Committee to oversee this program. And this is part 2. Today we're going to talk about how to use the visual assessment protocol for monitoring cyanobacteria. So our monitoring program goals are to quickly share information about conditions of concern. Cyanobacteria can appear and disappear rapidly, and we want to be able to evaluate and quickly share this information with as many people as possible. The second goal is to gather data about cyanobacteria conditions on Vermont inland lakes. Not all of our inland lakes have been monitored. We do not have a lot of information about cyanobacteria on many of our lakes. As I mentioned in part 1, under general ecology, cyanobacteria are found everywhere. They're not always abundant and obvious to us, but they are present on many of our water bodies. We also like to use this data that is collected using the visual assessment approach to provide a consistent way to talk about cyanobacteria conditions and to help facilitate a consistent approach to how we respond to those conditions when they occur. And finally, we want to help everyone recognize cyanobacteria wherever they may occur. There are concerns for human and animal health with exposure to cyanobacteria. Some cyanobacteria can produce potent toxins that are harmful, and we want to make sure that everyone knows what they look like, because the best way to reduce your chances of becoming ill after exposure to cyanobacteria is to avoid coming in contact with them. So we ask our volunteers to monitor usually a single site over the summer. In 2020, we will begin monitoring June 29th, the week of June 29th, and we will end that first week of September. This is when many folks go back to work, their children go back to school, and life changes, and so monitoring is not something they can continue. If you can monitor at your location longer than September, we would greatly appreciate having that data. The tracker system will remain live, but normally we do ask that you monitor between late June and that first week of September. Choose a day and a time to monitor. We found that you're less likely to bias your report, if you will. You won't be as tempted to select to report only when you see cyanobacteria. We want to know what conditions are like, both when cyanobacteria are present, but also when they're not present, because it gives us a better understanding of your lake. We ask that you make observations between 10 and 3. Cyanobacteria can regulate where they are in the water column to some extent. When the sun is out and they are able to do photosynthesis, they're more likely to want to be at the water surface, and those conditions occur between 10 and 3. So we'd like you to report then if possible. You'll post your observations on the Cyanobacteria website, and we'll talk as we get to that point about other options for reporting in case that tracker website is not working for you. For those of you that do see cyanobacteria blooms, it would be great if you could report to us on a daily basis until those blooms disappear. It helps us understand the conditions that lead to bloom formation at the surface and what causes them to disappear. So if you have the ability to go back every 24 hours after you've reported a bloom, that's very helpful to us. So the basic protocol each week is to go to your site on the same day and time to make the visual assessment. We'll ask you to take photographs under certain conditions and then report what you see through the online reporting form. So let's look now at the visual assessment categories. We have 3 categories: generally safe, low alert, and high alert. And we've divided the first category, the generally safe conditions, into several smaller categories to better capture the conditions that you're likely to see in the water. So category 1A is when there are no cyanobacteria or other things present. The water is clear. If you were to stand in the water up to your knees, you should easily be able to see your feet. You should be able to see the rocks and things on the bottom. If you were out in the middle of the lake, if you were anchoring, or you happen to have a secchi disc, or you're lowering your canoe or kayak paddle into the water, you can see it clearly. There's basically nothing in the water there. That's category 1A. Category 1B reflects brown and turbid conditions. This is usually due to sediment. Some lakes and ponds will have this kind of brown suspended look to the suspended sediment look to the water frequently. Others will only get it after a rainstorm. But basically, if you look closely, you can't really see any particulates. It's just a general discoloring of the water that's brown, again, due to suspended sediments. So that is category 1B. Still considered generally safe because there should be very few cyanobacteria here. Category 1C is kind of a catch-all for all sorts of materials. It can include other plants, but also other phenomena that we see on the water. Looking at the top left photo, that is a picture of pine pollen on the water. Those conditions here in Vermont are likely to occur in June, mid to late June, when the white pines especially are releasing their pollen. They can release huge clouds when the conditions are right. Those clouds, those pollen grains fall on the water surface, and they can accumulate in large masses. On Lake Champlain, I've seen streamers, if you will, of pine pollen a quarter mile or more in length. You can tell that this is pine pollen because of the coloring primarily. It's a mustardy yellow. It will float at the surface. It will accumulate in large groups and discolor the water like cyanobacteria can do, but cyanobacteria are unlikely to be this mustardy yellow. A way to confirm that you might be seeing a pollen mass on the water is to look at your car or other structures near the lakeshore. They'll often have a dusting of pollen on the windshields or on the windows. If there are puddles in the parking lots, you will also see that pine pollen is accumulating there. So look for those additional cues if you think you might be seeing pollen. The second photo at the lower left shows filamentous green algae, and I'll talk a little bit more about recognizing them in the next slide. But filamentous green algae are very common along our shorelines. They can be entangled in among aquatic plants in the water. And at certain times of the year, there's a lot of them. So filamentous green algae is a common report from our volunteers each summer. The middle picture shows an accumulation of detritus, for lack of a better word. There's a bunch of stuff that's fallen into the water. Wind and waves have combined to push it together in masses that are floating at the surface. The lower left of that middle photograph, you can see green, that is filamentous green algae. There's kind of a brown color, which is just general plant material, but the whitish material is primarily cottonwood fluff. When cottonwood and willows release seeds, they're very similar to dandelions. They have that white, fluffy material that allows the wind to carry them great distances. When they fall on the water, that material comes together in masses that look like this, and it captures everything else that's there in the water as well. So again, be looking at conditions on the shoreline when you're seeing something like this, because it might help you interpret what's been accumulating at the water surface. The other thing that's reported in this category is duckweed. Looking at the photograph on the lower right, you can see from a distance duckweed can look like cyanobacteria. It's greenish, it's accumulating at the surface in masses. It can be dispersed by wind and waves. You'll find when you look closer that duckweed has individual leaves that are very clearly visible, like in the photograph at the upper right. If you were to turn those little groups over, you would see that they have roots as well. Cyanobacteria do not have leaves, they do not have roots, so this is not a cyanobacteria. So simple checks that you can use to see whether cyanobacteria are present is the one thing that we call the jar test, and then the other is the stick test. The images here are from a PowerPoint presentation given by the Wisconsin Department of Environmental Conservation. The jar test takes advantage of the fact that cyanobacteria can produce small gas vacuoles within their cells that allow them to regulate where they are in the water column. If you take a jar of water, mix it a little bit so that everything's evenly distributed, and then set it aside for 10 to 15 minutes, cyanobacteria will float to the top, and other algae and debris will sink to the bottom. Okay, so it's a good first cut. If you're not sure that what you're seeing is cyanobacteria, give it a little bit of an opportunity to make use of those gas vacuoles. And if it floats to the surface, it's likely to be cyanobacteria. Again, duckweed and pollen will also float to the surface, so there's some other questions you need to ask yourself to make sure that you feel this is confident to be cyanobacteria. The other thing that you can use is the stick test. Filamentous green algae, like I said, are very common, and people at first don't recognize them. So this is a test that you can do to figure out whether you're looking at filamentous green algae. Take a stick, or in this case a forceps or a rake, see if you can lift it out of the water. If you do, filamentous green algae will form these long strands. They look hair-like. You can pull them apart and form long hairs, as the gentleman is doing there with the rake. Most of the time they don't stretch quite, 5 feet, but they will stretch out, and they don't break. They tend to stretch and form these filaments. There's a lot of video on the web. If you were to do a search on jar test cyanobacteria or stick test cyanobacteria, you can see videos and get more explanation of how that test is conducted and what you're looking for. So the final category in our first level of assessment, the generally safe designation, is what we call category 1D. A little cyanobacteria is present, but not a lot. You can see in the image on the left that the water looks pretty clear. If you were to stand in it up to your knees, you would notice perhaps particulate particles floating by, but in general the water is pretty clear. You do the jar test, that can help you see those particles a little bit better and evaluate whether they might be cyanobacteria if they float to the surface. But as I mentioned in the previous video, in part A, an individual cyanobacteria cell produces very little toxin, if toxins are present at all. Not all cyanobacteria have the ability to produce toxins, and they do not always produce it, even if they can. You cannot tell by looking. So a small amount of cyanobacteria will only be able to produce a small amount of toxin and not at a concentration that is likely to make anyone ill unless they're extremely sensitive. So we include category 1D so that you could note there's a small amount of cyanobacteria present, but not enough that we are concerned about recreating on the water. It still falls into that generally safe designation. Things change when you see cyanobacteria begin to accumulate at the surface or a larger number of particles in the water. We refer to this condition as low alert, and we recommend that you avoid contact with cyanobacteria in situations like this. We also call this category 2 cyanobacteria at less than bloom levels. What we're seeing here is that cyanobacteria is starting to accumulate at the surface. Sometimes it can be like you see in the image on the left, out in the middle of a lake, just small patches that may form around other things that are floating at the surface. It can be like you see in the middle image here, an area along the shoreline where the wind and the waves are gently pushing cyanobacteria together. And you can see here that the densest accumulations are right at that shoreline, and as you go further out, there's less and less cyanobacteria. You can go you should be able to go to another location in this lake and find a location where cyanobacteria are not present and recreation is fine. Sometimes when the wind and waves are a little bit more active, you'll see cyanobacteria colonies distributed throughout the water column. They're not accumulating at the surface. They're kind of giving the water an overall general greenish color. This is also something people should be aware of, because when the wind and waves die down, then those cyanobacteria may be able to accumulate and gather at the surface. So we do use the low alert category to give an indication that there may be cyanobacteria conditions of concern in this area, and that you should be careful where you choose to recreate and avoid contact with cyanobacteria wherever you see them. The highest level for our system we call high alert. This is category 3. A bloom is in progress. There is a large amount of cyanobacteria present and accumulating over a large area. That is the very big distinction between category 2 and 3, how much of an area is affected by the cyanobacteria bloom that you're seeing. So starting with the image on the left, cyanobacteria are often mistaken for spilled paint on the water. They form a layer at the surface of pretty bright coloring. Cyanobacteria produce chlorophyll, which gives them a greenish color. Some of them also have the pigment phycocyanin, which can give a blue coloration, or phycoerythrin, which can give a red coloration. So in general, blooms, when they accumulate, tend to be of a bluish-green color, but not always. In Vermont, we do see other colorings, but in general, a bloom will be a greenish or bluish green. In the image on the left, you can see white. When cyanobacteria have been at the surface in bright sunshine on very warm water, they're literally being cooked, and the cells break open, the internal materials released into the water, and it can form white foams and white colorations. This is a situation of concern. In addition to the cyanobacteria being present, if toxins are produced by these cyanobacteria, the levels can be very high. So again, category 3 is our highest risk situation. Again, the amount of area that you're seeing affected determines whether this is a category 3. Sometimes you are not seeing blooms at the surface, but very, very dense green water, as in that second picture from the left. You can see the scum at the surface, and then where the motorboat went through, it stirred all that cyanobacteria into the water to create a very, very green water. So there are lots of ways to visualize what this high alert situation looks like. If you think you see cyanobacteria, we would like you to take photographs. So if you are going to send in a report that includes a category 1D, a category 2, or a category 3, we would like you to provide photographs to help us interpret and understand and confirm what you are reporting. You'll take a close-up of the water surface, as you can see in the image on the left. This allows us to see better what you're seeing, again, right at the water's edge. We also want to have this broad view, as you see in the middle photograph, to tell us what it looks like down the beach and out further into the water. The difference between a category 2 and 3 often depends on how much of the area is affected. And so that middle photo helps us interpret that. And finally, we'd like you to do a jar test when you think there are cyanobacteria present. Do that jar test and take a picture of the results to send to us. Again, it'll help us interpret what you're seeing. You'll send your information to us and share it with us through the Department of Health's Cyanobacteria Tracker. We may get in contact with you if we have questions about what we're seeing or we need a little bit more information. These photographs are the first step, but you may also hear from us as well. Please be sure to label your photograph clearly. At a minimum, it needs to include the date and the lake, and preferably your initials or something like that, so that we know what we are looking at on each day. We get hundreds of photos a year, and having them named well enables us to search through and sort them very rapidly. So please do take care to label them well. Some volunteers prefer to add a label right within the photograph, as you can see in the image on the left. It's easy enough to write that information out and hold it up on a card behind the jar when you're taking the jar photo, or out in front of you when you're taking that broad view, and that works well also. So let's talk now about some unusual cyanobacteria that we have had reported to us over the years. The first of these is Gliotrichia. Gliotrichia is common across Vermont. Most people don't notice it unless they're looking closely. The image on the right shows Gliotrichia underneath the microscope. They look a little bit like starbursts, bursts of sunshine, sun rays around the sun, or they remind me a lot of the Whoosh Cush toys that my children used to play with when they were younger. When you look into the water, it looks a little bit like grains of tapioca. In many cases in Vermont, there are small amounts of Gliotrichia present all summer long, well distributed throughout the water column in conditions that would be equivalent to category 1D, not of concern for folks that are recreating on the water. They do occasionally form scums, as you can see in the middle photograph, and when they do, they look a little bit like pollen. So that's when you'll ask yourself those questions about what time of year is it? Is there a chance that a tree or a plant might be shedding pollen? If you look at the jar test there on the left, you can see that the accumulation at the surface is not so green, it's more brown-yellow, which again made the volunteer initially think that this was a pollen layer at the surface. However, when you look closely at that image, you can see that they're forming very clear granules, tapioca-sized pieces floating in the water. Pollen doesn't do that. It really looks more like a powder or very highly variable shapes to what's floating at the surface. So once we got these images, we reached out to that volunteer. She was able to get us a sample, and we were able to confirm that this was Gliotrichia. So those of you that are on Lake Champlain, Gliotrichia is present there. As I mentioned, it's also present on other inland lakes. Cyanobacteria is an unusual cyanobacteria that we've been seeing on Lake Champlain we saw on Lake Champlain for the first time in 2012, and we've now seen on other inland lakes. It's what we call a benthic cyanobacteria. It usually grows on the bottom. It may also grow on plants. This cyanobacteria can be picked up with a stick. When it forms an accumulation that's floating at the surface, as you see in the image on the right, it can be lifted up with a stick, as you see in the image on the left. You can also see in that image on the left that it looks a lot like filamentous green algae. When you lift it out of the water on a stick, it's not going to form those long hairs. If you were to take pieces and pull it apart, it would not separate into long hairs, it would break. If you were to put a piece of this in your jar and leave it for 15 minutes, you probably wouldn't see it change. It would not float to the surface. But overnight, you might see the individual cyanobacteria filaments migrating out of that piece along the edges of the jar and giving that blue-green coloring to the edge of the jar. Cyanobacteria is a highly variable cyanobacteria. The image there on the left shows it underneath the microscope, so it is a filament. Those clear spots in the filament show where it can break so easily. That's one of its strategies for being, for growing in many different places. The mats break easily and can spread easily. The images on the right give you an idea of what it looks like a little bit closer up. You can see that blue-green coloring. You can see on the edge of the one on the upper right that the filaments can break free and move out from that central mass. The image on the lower right, in that case, the Cyanobacteria was battered by waves, I believe, so that it formed a really dense piece of material that I could lift out, and it tore almost like rubber or cardboard. It was very interesting. And then when we thought we understood what a Cyanobacteria looked like in this benthic format, we got the image in the middle from some of our state park staff on Lake Carmi, where Cyanobacteria did not look like filamentous green algae. Instead, it looked like floating paint on the water. And then they stuck a stick in it, and you can see it did not act like paint on the water. It did coat the stick, give it a green coloring, but the mat started to come up out of the water as though it were a filamentous green algae, and then it broke. All right. So explore when you see unusual things. Consider a couple of different ways where you can explore what that thing might be. Rivularia is another cyanobacteria that we occasionally see. These images are from Lake Maury, where it's been reported more frequently than other locations in Vermont. Rivularia is something that is a cyanobacteria that usually grows attached to plants or something like that, as you can see in that image on the lower left. It can be found floating. Indeed, the Lake Maury bloom of Rivularia was reported by long-distance swimmers who were encountering pea-sized to egg-sized colonies in the middle of the lake when they were swimming. The colonies are gelatinous. They're gelatinous. They will not squish into a thin paint-like layer in your fingers if you were to crush them. It takes some effort to crush them. They're elastic, if you will. And again, they can range in size from pea size to egg size. In most cases, when we see something like Rivularia in the water, even though it's over a large area, we consider this a category 2 because it's usually widely distributed. Nostoc is another colony-forming cyanobacteria that can be attached, and it can also grow in the ground. We've had reports of folks finding nostoc growing in their driveway, for example. So it's a very versatile organism. The image on the right shows a cluster of nostoc colonies from Lake Winona last year. You can see that they are greenish, a little variation in color from a more green to a more olive green. Colonies are pea-sized or smaller in lakes. If you were to find this growing on the land, they would be larger. Again, kind of gelatinous. It takes some effort to squish them on your fingers. Do remember that cyanobacteria aren't always green. The image on the left is from High Pond, Vermont, where Vermont DEC monitor regularly during the summer. And there is at least 1 week when they come up there where they are finding these floating mats of pink cyanobacteria. Now, these are cyanobacteria that typically grow on the bottom. When photosynthesis is going strong, the oxygen that they release can get captured in among the mats, and that they break loose then and float to the water surface. In this case, they have a large amount of the pigment phycoerythrin, and so they turn pink under certain conditions. The image on the right is from St. Albans Bay during a very intense bloom when the water is very, very warm. You can see the blue coloring particularly well in this photo, especially along the shoreline. And then you can see that white material that forms when the cells have broken open and the wind and the waves have kind of frothed up that material. You can also see in the very lower right that blue is accumulated on the shoreline as well. That cyanobacteria material was tossed up onto the shore by the wind and the waves. If toxins are present in this particular bloom, they can also be present in that material along the shoreline. There are cyanobacteria lookalikes in Vermont and other places. This is a private pond where the owner was concerned they were experiencing a cyanobacteria bloom. But in general, this pond didn't meet the normal criteria. It wasn't high in nutrients. There's not a lot of human activity along the shoreline. You can see that it's well wooded and well protected. But looking at it, it had all the characteristics of a cyanobacteria bloom. So we asked her to send us a sample. And when she did, we found that it was not a cyanobacteria bloom. It was instead a bloom of euglena, which is a common phytoplankton, a common algae in lakes and ponds around Vermont. So again, we may ask you to send additional samples to help us confirm that what you're seeing is indeed a cyanobacteria. With that, I will end part 2 of our cyanobacteria monitoring training. Please continue on to part 3, which will tell you how to get your reports that you provide into the cyanobacteria tracker database that the Vermont Department of Health maintains. Thank you.